Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I hope that you are well as you are listening to this. I want to dedicate an episode to sharing what I've learned about navigating hard astrology. Now, I think this is a really interesting and important topic because a question that I receive constantly is that I have people coming to sessions or classes, and it's a variation of the same question, which is something hard is happening in my life. Can you see it in my chart? And what do I do about it? Usually my first response is, I get it. I get it. I can see how it's challenging for you right now. I see it in the chart. And on a human level, I'm usually not exempt from that either. Whatever the person is experiencing by way of transit, I'm usually experiencing as well in some other area in my life, right? And then on the flip side, there's also the other kind of experience, which is people coming to me and being like, hey, everything in my life is really good. But this astrologer or this astrology app told me that the next year is going to look really hard. And now I'm freaking out, right? Help me. And so I think this is really worth some considerations. This is really worth some time for us to reflect on, because this is a really multi-layered experience, right? The experience of being with hard astrology can either point to one, a phenomenon of something's really hard in my life right now, and I need astrology to help me understand what the problem even is. Or the second option is this experience of looking at something that looks hard, right? That doesn't feel hard yet in our body or in our lived experience, but looks really hard. And if you are listening to this at the time I'm releasing it, I'm currently recording this in March 2025, and we're kind of having the experience that is a mixture of experience 1 and experience 2. Right? We're having a mixture of looking at astrology that looks really hard, and also if we turn on the news and we look at what's going on around us, really not that great either. So what do we do, right? When we look at the energy, first of all, I want to spend a little bit of time to kind of look at the energy behind this question, right? If we feel into the question of what do I do when the astrology is hard? Underneath it, there's usually some confusion, there's pain, perhaps there's grief, there's rage, regret, or some version of blaming the self or blaming the world. Many of us come to astrology in order to seek comfort, answers, illumination, and more often than not, when we look at the astrology, the act of looking at these planetary configurations and talking about them puts something into motion, right? Something happens and it calms us down. My sense is that at its best, astrology can help us more deeply understand the root of our problems. Astrology offers a narrative that our minds can chew and digest. And as the mind chews and digests, our nervous systems and our energy body gets a chance to relax. And in that relaxation, we return to flow. We connect with our own internal resource. And then something starts moving. This, I think, is one of the reasons why so many people love listening to astrology forecast. myself included. This is part of why I continue to get the feedback that when I talk about astrology on the podcast, it helps someone. But this is not always the case. Other times you dig into the astrology, and the more you dig, the worse your fear, your anxiety, or your grief seems to get. So I get curious about this experience, right? Why is it that at certain times astrology can provide comfort, relief, illumination? And why is it that at other times looking at the astrology makes things worse? So astrology at its core is a tool. Unlike what a lot of people believe, astrology is not a belief. Astrology is a tool, and like any tool, the effectiveness depends on how we use it, right? Astrology is like a hammer. If you don't know how to use a hammer, if you're using the wrong end of the hammer, it's probably going to do more damage than good. It's not just about knowing intellectually how to use astrology. It's also about having the awareness of when and why using astrology can be helpful. And the truth is, there's no such thing as an objectively hard astrology. And some people might disagree with me, but bear with me here. I think that hard astrology is subjective. Experiences are hard because they strike a specific chord in someone's life that impacts them personally. In other words, when you hear someone say, the astrology is hard right now, what I hear is, my life feels really hard right now, right? And that is a personal and subjective experience. Now, we use astrology effectively as a tool when we are able to pair our astrological knowledge and fluency with this heartfelt compassion and acceptance of the human experience, right? How do we do that? So I'll share 3 points that I find really helpful to consider, specifically in the context of looking at our own astrology, meaning you know your chart or you put in your birth information on an app somewhere and you got your chart, and then now you're looking at your own information, right? Maybe you're looking at the transit for the coming month and you say to yourself, wow, that sounds really hard. Mars on my moon looks hairy. Or maybe you look at an aspect that exists in your natal chart. Maybe you look at having moon in Capricorn and you've heard somewhere that some astrologer said, that's a really challenging placement, right? So I want to speak to that experience of us looking at our own chart and whatever feeling or energy or memory arises within us when we look at this astrological information. I think there's something here for you regardless of where you're at in your journey. Whether you're a beginner, you're just learning the building blocks of astrology, or maybe you're pretty fluent and you're talking to friends about it, or even if you are a professional, there's something for you here. Something I've been talking about with some of my colleagues is how hard it can be to look at our own chart. So even professional astrologers are not exempt from this experience of having astrological insight and having that experience be quite challenging to navigate. So let's zoom in here. Here's my first point. To navigate challenging astrology, first and foremost, study yourself deeply. Study your own current moment experiences in full color and with great nuance. Study all the details and resist staying at the surface of your experience. Notice here that I don't start with the astrology. I start at studying the self and the experience of the self. There's a tendency when we're suffering to either shy away from looking at the suffering or to completely drown in our own suffering. First of all, this makes total sense. Why? Because being with suffering is really hard, and most of us simply don't have a model for it. For most people, their parents don't really model healthy, wise relationship with suffering. That's why a lot of us seek spiritual teachers and guides and therapists and self-help thinkers and books, because we need to see a different perspective. We need to build new habits. We certainly don't see our world leaders modeling healthy attitudes towards conflicts and hardships and sufferings, right? Otherwise, we would not have wars. What we see modeled on the political stage or the larger world stage in general is this finger-pointing attitude and approach towards suffering, right? We blame other people for our suffering. So we begin there. We begin with recognizing I don't have a great role model for how to be with suffering. And I'm human, and part of the human experience is I suffer. When we begin there, we recognize and embrace our limitation, which helps us normalize what we experience. Now, why is it so easy to shy away or to drown in our suffering? Because suffering is overwhelming, and navigating suffering skillfully requires practice. Let's use an example here. Let's say you're an adequate swimmer. You know how to swim at the pool of your, let's say, local country club, but you're not an advanced swimmer in the wild, right? Maybe you've never even practiced swimming in the wild. Then you need to recognize that trying to swim across a local lake when your boat malfunctioned in the middle of the lake is not the same as swimming at the pool at the local YMCA. It's really not, right? And so in the context of suffering, if you've never even taken the time to feel into your somatic experiences with hard emotions, right? And you've never really had to experience practicing what it's like to unravel some of those emotions in controlled settings with trusted practitioners or space holders, chances are being with suffering is really hard, right? And even if you have a lot of practice, the real world will humble you, right? If we want to get better at navigating suffering, we need to learn the skills. And like learning anything, it requires patience. Patience with ourselves, patience with the process, and it requires time. So you may ask, what are the skills necessary to navigate suffering? There are literally so many different ways to answer this question. The great religious traditions all try to come up with their own version of the answer, right? And this is where I personally would suggest that you start, which is get to know what precisely makes you scared. Because usually when it comes to navigating suffering, we're scared of something. There's fear somewhere in there. And I challenge you to be specific with your fear, to be really precise, to get to the bottom of that fear. The first fear that you come up with or that you can think of, usually there's a bunch of other fears layered somewhere in there. For most people, myself included, fear is an energy. Now, when I do energy work practices, often I see fear as a cloud that hangs around me. It's like a ghost that follows us around and spooks us out. But when you get precise about what it is you're afraid of and why you're afraid of it, more often than not, the fear starts to disintegrate. The fear starts to transform. It may not completely transform into joy or completely transform into this big spiritual realization, but it will just start transforming. It will start shifting around, maybe a little bit less sharp in how it feels in your body and in your being. So, for example, let's say this astrology, a specific astrological transit or placement, right? Maybe the Venus retrograde that is happening as I'm recording this. Maybe it brings up money challenges for you. Or you read somewhere that money is going to be tight when Venus is in retrograde, right? And maybe you're starting to see that in your lived experience. You're starting to see, oh, yeah, I guess that interpretation is correct. Not as much money is coming in this month through my business. And maybe it feels extra hard for you to go out there and to promote your work because especially if you're sensitive, maybe you perceive that everybody around you struggles with money right now, this is kind of its own loop, right? That can happen. So if this is something that you're experiencing, let's say, what I would recommend in terms of getting to know that fear is asking yourself, what about this money flow challenge makes me scared? What about it? What about it is, what am I making up as the worst case scenario here? And then really get very honest with yourself. What is the likelihood of this worst case scenario actually happening? When I walk myself through this process, often what I find is that maybe there's about 10 to 15% maximum of my worst fear happening. Most of the time, I know that I won't let it get to that point. There's quite a long way to go until we get to that point, right? Maybe in this case of money flow problems, maybe I'm really scared of being in $100,000 debt, right? But if I'm currently not in debt, that is a long way to go to get there, right? And there are many, many stops before I reach that final destination of absolute destitution and destruction, right? Not saying that having that much of a debt is destruction, because I know people who have managed to get out of that size of debt, right? Sometimes even more. So anything's possible. But once you're done with that step of recognizing, oh, actually maybe my biggest fear won't happen, right? It gets a little bit easier for us to work with this fear. There's shape to the fear. Even if the worst fear seems plausible, there's at least shape to it. We've given that fear a voice. Now, I also want to speak to a specific kind of experience here, which is that for a lot of people, their biggest fear is kind of an emotional experience. I've experienced this a lot, where when I look deeper in the layer of fear, what's kind of at the bottom layer is that I am unlovable, right? Or I am unworthy. Now, how do we navigate that kind of fear? First of all, I have to just serve it to you straight up, which is that fear is a complete lie. Of course you are worthy. Of course you are lovable. Maybe you're currently surrounded by people who are not reflecting that back to you, but that's not your fault. That doesn't mean you're not lovable. If your fear is related to some kind of story around the inherent goodness of who you are as a being, let me just tell you that fear is a lie. It's a lie, right? So you can just liberate yourself. If that's one of the fears, you fear that I will never be loved again if I go bankrupt. Guess what? There are plenty of people who are bankrupt who have people who love them. So don't worry about that. Your fear has its place, but it's probably not real. Now, once you're done with that step, here's what I like to do. I like to ask myself, what tiny steps can I take to mitigate the worst case scenario? And if the answer that comes up feels kind of big or not something that I can implement right away, then I try to get very granular and very specific, right? I find the tiniest thing I can do to mitigate the fear. So let's go back to the example. If money flow is challenging and you see that this month you're spending more than you make, then you know the answer here, right? Which is you need to cut some costs. Now, if you are doing that, what I would recommend is first find a spending that's inconvenient or maybe not preferable to cut, but doesn't actually hurt you that much, right? As an example, maybe you can cancel your Netflix subscription. I get it. It's not great that you can't watch Netflix using your own account for the next month, right? But you're not going to die, okay? So text a friend and ask for their password. You'll find a way, right? These tiny things need to be doable and they need to not be such a big deal in the grander scheme of things. So far, let's do a little review, right? What have we done here? First is we really get to know our fear. Oftentimes, the fear around our fear is bigger than the fear itself. Does that make sense? I've often found that my fearing the thing, right, without looking at it, makes the fear actually a lot worse. So the first step is look at the fear. And then second of all is do something about the fear, right? Get action oriented. Do something simple, something extremely doable. And that will signal to your body that you are not completely powerless in the situation. Okay, so now we're done with the hard stuff, right? That's on the fear end of things. That's on the negative end of things. Let's go into the positive end of things. The next component is to study deeply what are some of the activities, people, and things that resource you. And then to cultivate the discipline to actually do them. So for many of us, when we are looking at difficult astrology, one of the things that I love the most about astrology is that it gives you a hint of what you can do about it, right? It's not just saying times are going to be hard, right? It's also giving you a little bit of an idea of times are going to be hard in these specific ways, and therefore you can brainstorm some ways to possibly mitigate those challenges or be more prepared for those challenges. So what I like about this exercise of doing a deep dive on what resources us is, for many of us, finding the time and space for what we truly love, for what truly brings us joy, is not easy, especially when we're feeling activated and when fear is in our system. It's like, forget it, right? The last thing I'm thinking about is pivoting out of my fear bubble into doing something that I actually love, right? If this resonates with you, if this is part of your experience, we can call on some gentleness here. Again, this is a practice. So we start small and we commit to a steadfast pace when we want to create lasting change. We don't blow out our system. We don't berate ourselves for having a hard time, right? I like beginning with this list of resources because even though it's somewhat theoretical and maybe it's a little mental, right? It's a little brainy. This is a place where you get to take a little bit of time to even just conjure up the idea of the things that you actually enjoy. You can even be whimsical with it. Call this your pleasure list, or call this your miracles list, or call this your joy list, whatever you want, right? List making is actually really magical. It activates a part of your back brain, your subconscious, and directs it into recognizing the abundance that's always present. So what I like to do when I don't feel that great is I would just open up my list. I would open up my list of the things that bring me joy, the things that resource me, the people that bring me joy, and I read it to myself. And the result is usually quite immediate. It's like self-hypnosis, right? Even just reading this list and knowing some of these activities, these people, and that these things even exist, that can help a lot. If your app allows you to do it, I would also recommend bringing in some pictures of like memories of yourself doing the thing, or maybe if you have a pet, have a picture of your pet. That really changes your brain chemistry like so wildly. I mean, even right now, I'm thinking about my list and I'm conjuring the idea of my list and I'm already like laughing like a golden retriever, So it's really, really helpful. I really want you to try it. If you know you're someone who struggles with actually making time to engage in these activities, or if you're overcome with the sense of pessimism, like nothing's ever really going to work out for me anyway, so I might as well not do anything, then my trick for you is schedule a time on your calendar. Even just half an hour to make art, to watch funny videos on YouTube, or call your favorite sister. That can make all the difference in the world. Okay, so that's my first advice. That's a really detailed explanation of how I would study myself deeply. I study my fear, I study what resources me, and I do it. I give myself permission to do the thing. So why haven't I gotten to the astrology? Why are we talking about astrology and we haven't even gotten there? Here's my reasoning. Oftentimes, when we struggle with the astrology, or we experience a kind of hyperfixation on the doom and gloom possibilities of what the astrology might bring, we're actually not having issues with the astrology itself. I know, that is a wild statement I just made. Rather, some part of us is in denial around our experience with looking at the astrology. There's some sort of resistance we're having with our feelings. Maybe we're a little scared to look at our fears. We're a little scared to look underneath the hood of some of those mental images that we are serving ourselves. Paradoxically, we get to the other side of the fear. We get to the other side of the grief by bringing attention to them. There's a saying that I hear a lot within spiritual circles, which is, what you pay attention to grows in intensity. And along with that, I found that a lot of people avoid looking at their fears or their heart emotions because they fear that looking at the thing that feels kind of hairy or scary will make it grow. Now, based on my experience as a practitioner, personally, and in creating space for other people to work with challenging experiences, this is pretty much a fallacy. This is pretty much totally wrong, right? I'm not someone who likes to say this is completely wrong, but I think this one is actually. Fear grows when we energetically merge with it. When we completely identify with the fear, that's when the fear can feel insurmountable. Now, when we look at our fears, the decision that we made to be willing to look at the fear, that in and of itself is an act of separating energetically from the fear. So when you decide to look at your fear, what you're doing is you're making a decision to step out of this movie that the fear is playing in your head. You're deciding to step out of the loop that you've been putting yourself in. And therefore, you're still looking at the fear, right? But you're taking some of your energy back from the fear. So going back to that idea, right, of what you pay attention to grows in intensity, I don't totally agree with that. I think that what grows in intensity is the thing that you give your power to. The thing that grows in intensity is the thing that you relinquish your agency towards, right? But when you take back some of your energy and you pay attention to the thing, it doesn't necessarily grow unless you want it to grow. You see my point? Okay, so now on to the astrology. My second point is to navigate challenging astrology, study the astrological pattern deeply. Take your time and don't rush into conclusion. Give yourself time to research the archetypes that are involved. Give yourself space to play around with the symbols. Maybe look at some of the mythologies that are associated with some of these astrological symbols. Thankfully, a lot of the astrological symbols like the signs and the planets or the asteroids are associated with certain stories, mythologies. You can look at them even cross-culturally. You're not confined to just looking at the Greek or the Roman culture, which is where a lot of Western astrology comes from, right? You can also look at some of these symbols in other cultures and study them. Study them and really treat them with reverence, right? Knowing that you don't know everything. Again, there's something magical to studying the astrology in color and with great nuance. I recommend study all the details. Resist staying at the surface. So basically, I'm giving you the same advice, but now apply it to the astrology itself. Often, the hardest thing is to look at ourselves, right? To look at our own fears, to look at our own judgments, to look at our own resistance, to look at our own frames that we get stuck in. That's the hard part. Once we know how to do that, looking at the astrology tends to be a lot less challenging. But still, many of us try to force ourselves to reach a conclusion when we look at the astrology. This is kind of a weird thing that I notice in a lot of astrological communities, right? And you know what? Fuck it. I do it too. I do it too. I do it too. I often look at the astrology and I try really quickly to come up with conclusions about what this is going to bring or how this is going to feel, right? I think that this is a byproduct of our cultural framework. We live within a culture where we're always trying to prove how much we know and how intelligently we can express what we know, right? In order to be a subject matter expert, you know? So it makes a lot of sense that we also bring that hasty attitude to reach conclusions to prove that we are good astrologers, right? Or that we know what we're talking about. Studying the astrology deeply is not limited to advanced astrology students and professionals. It also applies to astrology beginners and enthusiasts. Something I hear a lot of beginners say is, well, my astrology understanding is not comprehensive enough to know what this astrology is going to bring. To which I need to say, hold up. There's so many wrong assumptions in that sentence alone. First of all, nobody knows what's going to happen, right? If you think that your lack of astrological knowledge is contributing to you not knowing what the astrology is going to bring, guess what? The more you study astrology, it will not increase your ability to know what's going to happen, because nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody. And if somebody is trying to tell you that they know what is going to happen, ask for your money back. Ask for your time back. You can safely get this idea out of your head. Here's the thing. Astrologers are not fortune tellers. We're really not. We are people who study symbols, people who learn how to read charts, and then to make intelligible and hopefully helpful and useful inference based on that pattern. that we are seeing, the symbols that we are studying. You will never know what the astrology is going to bring. I don't care if you're a professional or if you've been studying for decades, you cannot fully know anything with 100% certainty. Anyone who thinks they know for sure is lying. So now, if you are new to learning astrology and you want to get more serious about it, then first of all, I would say this is a very exciting time for you. I am so excited that you decided to embark on this journey. Personally, it's a part of my journey that I look back on with so much fondness, because I think the first year or so of learning astrology is just such a lovely, tender chapter. So if that's you, first of all, honor yourself here. You may have more questions than you do answers, and that's a good thing. My encouragement for you is to do some research about the specific astrological configuration. Let's say, again, you are looking at this Venus retrograde in Aries and Pisces, or maybe you're looking at the eclipse. You can find different podcast episodes, you can find different memes on social media, you can even try to find books about it. And I would say, again, really resist the temptation to rush into knowing what it means. The meaning always unfolds over time. The meaning will become apparent to you sooner or later. And the meaning can be highly personal for you. It may be something that you notice outside of you, or it can be something that you notice happening within your life. And then it's kind of up to you to decide what meaning makes sense to you, right? But there's a process, and I think this process is the most important part of learning astrology and being with astrology, which is you get to enjoy the process of knowing more about the symbols. You get to enjoy the process of learning to see reality from a symbolic point of view. If you are patient, what I would really recommend is parse out the different elements and study their symbology one by one. So let's use the example of the Venus retrograde that we're currently in at the time of me recording this. This is a Venus retrograde in the signs of Aries and Pisces. So you can first find out, okay, what does a retrograde mean? Not just in terms of its kind of metaphysical or emotional meaning, right? But also in terms of what phenomenon am I looking at? What is a retrograde? What causes a planet to move in apparent retrograde motion from the perspective of Earth? Maybe you can even go outside and check out, can I actually see that Venus is moving backwards? What's happening here, right? And then begin to ask metaphysically, what might that mean for me as a human being living on Earth? How might a planet that seemingly is moving backwards symbolically impact my life? How might it impact my ability to relate to other people? How might it impact my ability to bring in abundance and resources into my life? And then you can ask, what is the symbology of Venus? How do various ancient cultures understand Venus? Has Venus always been called Venus, or was there a different name for Venus? And then you can move on to the signs, right? What is the symbology of Aries? What is the symbology of Pisces? Are there certain stories or mythologies associated with these archetypes that I can get more curious about? And then start putting all the pieces together, right? You can ask yourself, what does Venus in Aries make me think of given what I know about Venus and Aries? What does Venus in Pisces make me think of, given what I know about Venus and Pisces, right? And then bring in again the piece around retrograde, right? What does the retrograde make me think of, right? What imageries is it bringing to mind? What memories is it bringing to mind? What sensations is it bringing to mind? So the key here is to focus on associations rather than meaning. Associations are what comes up for us, right? Like the series of questions I just asked. What are the sensations, the flavors, the smells associated with it? What images come up, right? And associations are so much more interesting to work with than meaning, because meaning is so vast, right? And sometimes, like I said earlier, meaning unfolds over time. But associations tend to be our own personal relationship with whatever is coming up. So when we ask ourselves, what does this mean? That's a big question. Maybe we'll never fully know as long as we're alive. Certain transits look really hard and really hairy, and then you go through them and you are like, what is all the fuss even about? Sometimes it doesn't even show up in your life. On the other hand, the question of, what does this make me think of? In other words, what is this associated with for me? Or what does this remind me of? These questions are much more specific, much less overwhelming, and they help you build a richer, more grounded, more rooted, and more embodied relationship with the astrology. So, what about if you are fluent in astrology, or if you are a professional astrologer? I would say that much of what I shared still applies, right? I personally find it helpful to always go back to the basics, and the more often I go to the basics, the deeper I get into the layers that are underneath the surface. But I would say, if you're already fluent in the basics, my recommendation is for you to more critically assess your own lens and your own biases on your interpretation. Now, let me be clear. There's nothing wrong with having a lens, right? There's nothing wrong with having certain personal feelings or having certain biases, right? But it's important to know about them. So here's an example of a common trap that a lot of people fall into, which is making a hasty conclusion that just because you know a certain person with a specific natal placement and that they exhibit certain traits in your relationship with them, you make that to mean that that's what it means to be a Scorpio or a Virgo, right? It's that, very common trap that a lot of people fall into, which is, oh, I dated that Scorpio once, and so all Scorpios are blah, 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 right? Or another example that's a bit more subtle is transits. You may have experienced a particularly memorable transit that involves certain planets in the past. And then from that point on, it's easy to just generalize and be like, all Saturn transits are hard, or all Jupiter transits are great, right? We all have seen the trope, and it's so much easier to see in other people than it is to see it in ourselves. And we all do it, right? I think getting out of this habit can be hard, but it's also extremely rewarding, because when we get out of the habit of there's I think a thin line to walk here, right? There's, on the one hand, the beauty of using our personal experiences to inform and expand our astrological vocabulary. But then on the other hand, there's also kind of a hardening, right, of some assumptions that we place on the planet or the placement or the transit. And here's something to consider, especially if you are pretty fluent in the language of transits. You will get this a lot more, which is no two transits are the same. You might be zeroing in, for example, on a Venus conjoined Pluto configuration transit, right? Even if you are looking at Venus conjoined Pluto in Aquarius, when you're looking at Venus conjunct Pluto in 2 different years, all the other planets are in different configurations, right? So for example, maybe in 2025, I'm just really going off the top of my head here. I'm not looking at a chart, but let's say the Venus-Pluto conjunction in Aquarius in 2025 was when Saturn was in Pisces, right? But then maybe in 2026, the ruler of Aquarius, Saturn, is going to be in Aries when Venus and Pluto are conjoining in Aquarius, right? So that already shifts so much, right? And so just because we have a prior experience on a transit, it doesn't mean that that experience wasn't valid, right? But it does mean that we need to be more discerning about how we take that experience into interpreting the future or delineating or giving color to a future astrological transit, right? I think the question that's always more interesting is, what can I learn from this upcoming transit? What can I pay attention to? What can I potentially discover from this transit that I didn't know before? How can I attune myself to the cosmic context so that I can become a vessel for love, for hope, for care during this transit? That is a much more generative and exciting and expansive question compared to what is going to happen with this transit, right? So, yeah, in summary, the subtle reframe here is to approach transits from a sense of possibility and from a sense of curiosity and a desire to find out more from the experience rather than locking in a scary meaning to the transit. I'm not saying that hard astrology is not going to bring difficult experiences. They might very well do that. That is the thing that happens, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. And also at the same time, I don't think doom and gloom astrology is the best use of astrology. I really don't. I think it's lacking creativity. I think it's lacking nuance. And I think it's lacking spiritual maturity. And I think it's time that, especially if you are listening to this podcast and you are interested in astrology, I would say you're already in the astrology community, even if you are a beginner. And I think we can do better. I think we can be more interesting with our approach to astrology. I think it's time. Okay, so here's my last point, and this one is short, which is to remind yourself that nothing is permanent. Here's a paradox that we hold as humans. The experience of being afraid is very real in our bodies. And perhaps fear itself is an illusion. A Course in Miracles says, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. And so perhaps this is a more interesting orientation to our fear. That it's a both end, right? It's that on the one hand, we can acknowledge the fear that is in our body, the experience of being afraid, the experience of being nervous, the experience of hardship, right? That things feel really hard at certain points. And we can also hold that it's not permanent, and maybe it's not even the highest reality of our existence. That maybe there's a deeper layer of reality that is radically different than this kind of surface experience, right? So that's something to consider. Perhaps that lands for you, perhaps that doesn't. In any case, try it out. Try it out. Especially if you have a lot of resistance to this idea that fear is not real. Try out going around, walking in your reality, considering that maybe the fear is not real. What are you going to do then? If fear is a belief, and it's a belief that you can choose, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to be? Okay, that is all I have for you. I hope that this episode has been helpful in getting you thinking and feeling into how you might want to navigate heart astrology. And I have a couple announcements. One is, if you enjoy this episode, I would really love for you to share it with others in your community. Share it on social media. Leave us a review. Leave us a comment. It's really, really helpful. And it really helps other people find this work. So I would love your help in putting the word out there. And my second announcement is, if you are interested, I would love to work with you one-on-one. There are a few different ways to do that. The first one is get a 2025 astrology reading with me. So over 2 sessions, we'll talk about your astrology. We'll look at the collective transits as well as the transits that are personally meaningful to you. And we'll align that with your goals, your dreams, the challenges that you're currently facing. We can also work through a human design reading. I'm currently offering, again, a 2-session human design reading package where we get to talk about your life and your unique energetic pattern through the lens of the human design body graph. And the third offering, which I am super excited about, and I've never really talked about this publicly before, is my coaching and mentoring containers. So over the last couple of years, I've worked long-term with a select handful of clients and mentees. And to be really honest with you, this is where the good shit is. This is really where we get into the nitty-gritty of your life. And we not only affirm the things that you've known to be true about you through your astrology, through your human design body graph, but we also get really granular with regards to how you can bring more of you into any situation, into any projects, into any relationships that you have. A lot of the times when I do single readings, I love doing it, first of all, but it doesn't always get to the deep places that are necessary in order for meaningful transformation to actually happen. In order for that to happen, there has to be a more involved container. There has to be deeper intimacy and trust, and there also has to be time. And so these 3 components on top of your absolute brilliance and my work and my devotion and commitment to doing this work are all ingredients that lead to pretty transformative experiences. So if that's something that interests you, the links are in the show notes below. And for the coaching mentorship offering, you would have to apply, and we'll get on a call, talk about it, see if we are a match made in heaven for one another, and then we'll go from there. All right. I think that's it from me by way of announcement. Thank you so much for being here. I deeply appreciate your presence, especially if you're listening all the way to the end here. I hope that this month brings you as much joy, peace, care, and love as you wish to have in your life. And I can't wait to gather with you again whenever you tune in. I'm sending you a big hug over this virtual space, and I hope you take good care of yourself.